They say an alpha king's power is measured by the sound of his wolf. By the way the earth trembles when he shifts. By the fear in another alpha's eyes when claws split bone. But what happens when the king has no wolf? The night I opened the wrong door in the northern wing of the fortress, I discovered something that could have shattered the realm. Not a weapon. Not a prisoner. Not a prophecy. The most feared alpha in 5 territories. On his knees. Bleeding. And unable to shift. The corridor was not meant for me. The torches burned lower there. The stone colder. The air thick with iron and something I could not name. I was only meant to deliver sealed records to the royal archivist. Instead I heard it, a crack, then another. Not wood, bone, followed by a strangled sound that did not belong to a beast. Sounded human. I should have turned back. Everyone in the fortress knew the northern wing was forbidden during the full moon. Even guards avoided it. Servants whispered about curses. Warriors pretended not to notice. But curiosity is a dangerous thing when you live among wolves. I reached the door at the end of the hall. Armbound. Scratched. Scarred. Something struck the other side again. A low growl, then silence. My hand should have shaken. It didn't. I pushed it open. Moonlight spilled across stone. Chains bolted into the walls. Blood staining the floor. And in the center of the room the Alpha King. Cloak discarded. Hands clawed into stone. Spine arched in agony. Half shifted. Half broken. And when his golden eyes snapped to mine, there was no wolf behind them. Only fury. And fear. That was the moment I realized 2 things. If anyone else had seen this, he would lose his crown by dawn. And if he decided I couldn't leave that room, I would lose my life before sunrise. Before we step into the forbidden chamber, let's do a quiet pack check. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Is the moon already up? Or are you listening in daylight, pretending you don't believe in wolves? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this pack stretches. Across countries, across time zones, across midnight hours. And while you're down there, tell me this. If you discovered a secret that could destroy a king, would you protect it, or expose it? Well, let's open the door. He moved before I could breathe. 1 second he was on his knees. The next his hand was at my throat, pressing me into the iron-banded door I had just come through. The wood groaned behind my back. His grip was iron. Controlled. Not choking, but close enough that I understood the message. I wanted to. His face was close. Too close. Sweat-damp hair fell across his brow and there was blood at his lip. From biting down on something, I realized. From keeping himself silent. What did you see? His voice was barely above a whisper. Worse somehow than a shout. I held his gaze. Gold I had always heard. Golden-eyed like a beast mid-shift, the stories said. Feral. Terrifying. But what I saw was not feral. It was desperate. A man in pain, I said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. His grip didn't tighten. But it didn't release either. His chest rose and fell in uneven intervals. Too slow to be composed, too controlled to be panicked. I watched him recalibrate behind his eyes. Watched him decide something. I did not look away. There is a trick to surviving wolves. One the older servants had passed down in whispers. Never lower your eyes in submission if you are not prepared to mean it. An empty bow is more dangerous than standing still. I stood still. You shouldn't be here. His jaw tightened. No one comes to this wing. I heard someone hurt. You heard nothing. Then why is your hand still at my throat? Another silence. Longer. He released me slowly and stepped back. Not retreating. Reclaiming space. He straightened to his full height and the moonlight caught him differently from there, carving shadows into the tension at his shoulders, the line of his jaw, the way his hands curled at his sides as if still looking for something to grip. I noticed what was not in the room. No wolf. No shimmer of midshift gold beneath his skin. No second heartbeat in the air that always comes when a creature shares a body. Just a man. If you speak of this, he said quietly, to anyone, a guard, a servant, the air itself, I will know. And whatever I do next will not be kind. I should have nodded. Should have lowered my eyes, finally, and promised silence through the trembling gratitude of someone who understood how close they had come to dying. Instead I said, "And if I don't speak of it?" His expression shifted. Just barely. Something moved behind his eyes that was not fury and not fear. It was the look of a man who had not been asked a question in a very long time. "Then," he said slowly, "we will discuss what happens to you next." The torch in the corridor guttered. Neither of us moved. What happened next was this. I did not go home. My small room in the eastern servants' quarters. The cot with the broken leg propped on stone, the window that let in more wind than light, was no longer mine by morning. I learned this from the guard who appeared at the forbidden door before I had fully decided whether my legs still worked. He did not explain. He simply said, "Come," and turned. I followed because the Alpha King was still in the room behind me, and of the two directions available, the guard seemed less likely to kill me before sunrise. I was taken deeper into the fortress. Not to the dungeons. I noted that with the specific relief of someone who had genuinely considered it. The corridors we moved through were wider here, the torches better tended, the stone underfoot worn smooth by generations of people who mattered. We passed 2 sentries who looked through me entirely, which meant my presence here had been arranged, wordlessly, in the moments I had stood frozen in that chamber. He had already decided. The room I was given was larger than any I had occupied in 3 years of fortress life. A real hearth. A writing desk. A window with actual shutters. I stood in the center of it and understood with cold clarity that this was not generosity. This was proximity control. He wanted me close enough to watch. Far enough that no one would question the arrangement. The inner chambers were full of scribes, advisors, attendants whose specific functions no one ever examined too closely. I would simply become another unremarkable fixture in a wing full of people paid to be invisible. A knock at dawn. A different guard, a woman this time short-haired and expressionless. "You will continue your archival duties," she said. "Your assignments have been redirected to the inner records hall. You do not leave this wing without escort. And if I need, an escort will be arranged." She left. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and looked at the shuttered window. Outside I could hear the fortress waking, the clang of the training yard, the low calls of handlers with the morning animals, the distant rhythm of a pack that believed without question that their king was powerful and whole and exactly what they needed him to be. I thought about the room at the end of the northern corridor. The chains. The claw marks that didn't go deep enough. The blood that had layered over older blood. He had been doing this for a long time. Not one desperate night. Not a temporary illness or a wound that would close. This was a pattern. A ritual of failure he had built into the architecture of his own rule. Iron rings, narrow windows, a door thick enough to swallow sound. He had designed a cage for himself. And somehow, without meaning to, I had walked into it. The hearth fire crackled. Warm, steady, deliberately comfortable. I did not trust it for a moment. I saw him for the first time in daylight 3 days later. Not privately. Not the way I had seen him in that room. Undone, arched over stone, stripped of everything the crown required. This was the other version. The one the realm believed in. I was positioned at the inner records hall overlooking the war corridor when he passed below with his generals. I had not planned it. I had simply looked up from a ledger at the wrong moment and there he was. He was different. Every movement was architecture. The set of his shoulders, the measured pace, the way he occupied space as though the fortress had been built specifically to frame him. His generals flanked him in tight formation and he did not look at them when he spoke. They leaned toward him, adjusting their stride to catch his words, and he let them. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. I watched a man argue a supply route with enough force to redden his face, and the Alpha King simply waited. Let the words exhaust themselves. Then said something quiet and the argument ended. No claws. No dominance display. No wolf. Just precision. I returned to the ledger and wrote nothing for a long time. The thing I was beginning to understand, slowly the way you understand something you would prefer not to, was that he was not pretending to be powerful. He genuinely was. The wolf was absent and the authority remained, which meant the authority had never entirely belonged to the wolf. That distinction felt important. I wasn't sure why yet. Over the following days I built a careful map of his patterns. He woke before the fortress. His light was the first in the upper corridor, visible from the eastern yard if you happened to be awake to see it. And I happened twice to be awake to see it. He did not eat publicly if he could avoid it. His meetings were scheduled in the late morning, when the moon's pull was weakest and whatever was happening inside him was quietest. He avoided the great hall during pack gatherings. He had not attended a communal shift in 11 months. I found this in the records, attendance logs for ceremonial moon rituals, every senior figure in the pack accounted for, his name present at the top of each list and noted, in careful neutral script as represented by the royal beta. 11 months. Whatever had happened in that iron room was not new. The pack simply hadn't noticed yet or had chosen not to. But someone eventually would. I was replacing a file on the upper shelf when I became aware that the room had gone quiet behind me. The specific quiet of something waiting. I turned. He was in the doorway of the records hall. Alone. No generals, no guard. Looking directly at me. "You've been watching me," he said. Not an accusation. Almost curious. I thought about denying it. "Yes," I said instead. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite displeasure. Almost respect. He did not sit. I noticed that first. The way he positioned himself just inside the doorway of the records hall as though he had not fully committed to being here. One shoulder against the frame. Arms loose at his sides. It looked casual. It wasn't. Everything about him was a calculation dressed as ease. "You've been watching me," he said again. And I realized he was waiting to see if I would change my answer now that the initial shock of being caught had passed. I didn't. "You're easier to watch than most," I said. "You don't perform for the room the way the others do." Something moved across his face. "And yet you think I'm performing." "I think everything you do in public is deliberate." "That's not the same as false." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the ledger open on the desk before me, to the shelves behind, to the small details of a room he had clearly never had reason to enter before. Taking inventory. Filing information away. We were, I realized, doing the exact same thing to each other. "You're the archivist reassigned from the Eastern Wing," he said. "Sarah," I offered. He did not give his name back. He didn't need to. "How long have you worked in this fortress, Sarah?" 3 years. "And in 3 years you never learned that curiosity is fatal here." It wasn't quite a question. I folded my hands over the ledger. "I learned it," I said. "I simply weighed the cost and opened the door anyway." That's either very brave or very foolish. Most people would say the same thing about ruling without showing your wolf for 11 months. The air changed. I felt it before I saw it. A drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the hearth. His expression didn't collapse or harden. It did something more unsettling than either. It went completely still. I had miscalculated. Not the observation, the timing. Too soon. Too direct. I had moved like someone who had already earned the right to say that, and I hadn't, not yet, not nearly. I held his gaze anyway. Retreating now would be worse. 11 months, he repeated softly. "You went through attendance records." "I work in the records hall." "It's what I do." "And what else have you found in the records hall?" "Nothing I've spoken of." The answer landed the way I intended, as a reminder. I knew his secret and I had kept it and I would continue to keep it, and he already knew all of that, but sometimes a thing needs to be said plainly to mean anything. He pushed off the door frame. Straightened. "Don't go through records that don't pertain to your assignment," he said. He left without waiting for a response. I turned back to the ledger and stared at a column of numbers that suddenly meant nothing. My hands, I noticed, had been steady the entire time. That frightened me more than he did. The full moon rose on a Tuesday. I knew it was coming the way everyone in the fortress knew, not from calendars but from behavior. The pack grew restless 2 days before, voices louder in the corridors, laughter sharper, disputes at the training yards spilling past the usual boundaries. The wolves felt it in their blood before the sky confirmed it. That slow magnetic pull that tightened something animal and ancient inside them. I felt nothing being human. But I watched what it did to everyone else. What it did to him was subtler. Quieter. Where the pack expanded under the moon's approach, he contracted. His meetings shortened. The space he kept between himself and others widened by degrees so gradual I doubted anyone else measured it. He dismissed his personal guard earlier than usual the night before, and the night of the upper corridor outside his chambers was empty by the time the moon cleared the fortress wall. No guards. No attendants. Just a locked door and silence behind it. I sat at my desk in the inner chamber and did not sleep. I told myself it was the restlessness of the fortress around me, the distant howls beginning as the pack gathered in the lower yard for the communal shift, the sound vibrating through stone in a way that made the walls feel thin. It was easy to believe. It was not entirely true. I was listening for him. An hour past moonrise I heard it. Faint. Muffled by distance and thick walls and whatever he had stuffed against the base of his door to swallow the sound. But I had heard it once before in a corridor at close range, and the memory made it recognizable even from here. Bone shifting. Then stopping. Then the low, strangled silence of a man swallowing something that should have been a howl. I pressed my fingers flat against the desk and stared at the grain of the wood and thought about the attendance logs. 11 months. 11 full moons he had survived like this. Alone behind a locked door, forcing a shift that would not come while his pack gathered below and raised their voices to the sky and felt, in that communal animal way, completely whole. And then descended from the high of it. And came back inside. And passed him in corridors the next morning without knowing. I thought about what that cost. Not politically. Not strategically. The simple human weight of it. To be surrounded by belonging you cannot access. To perform wholeness so completely that no one thinks to check whether it's real. I understood that particular loneliness better than I wanted to admit. The sounds behind the distant door eventually stopped. I did not know if that meant success or exhaustion or simply that he had given up for another month. I returned to the ledger I had not been reading. Outside the pack howled on. The moon moved. And somewhere in the upper corridor, a king endured another night of silence where his wolf should have been. I said it on a Wednesday. In the middle of an ordinary afternoon in the records hall, with dust motes floating between us and nothing dramatic about the moment at all. He had come again, the third time in as many weeks. Always with a reason. A misfiled territorial document. A query about historical pack boundaries. Thin pretexts, carefully constructed, and I accepted them without comment because the alternative was acknowledging what was actually happening. He was checking on me. Not warmly. The way you check on a variable. A loose thread you haven't decided whether to cut yet. This time he stood at the far shelf, turning the pages of a census record he had no administrative reason to want. And I watched him from the corner of my eye and thought about the night before. The moon had been 3/4 full. He had cancelled 2 afternoon meetings. I knew because the beta had come to the records hall looking harried and tight-jawed, redistributing correspondence with the energy of a man managing something he didn't fully understand. And the Alpha King had spent the remainder of the day doing what I had begun to recognize as his version of pacing. Moving through the fortress on inspections that didn't need doing, finding problems in rooms that had none, keeping himself in motion because stillness let the pull catch up with him. I had watched it all and said nothing. But Wednesday arrived and he was standing 6 feet away pretending to read a census. And the words came out before I had properly decided to say them. "You're afraid of it." He turned a page. "I fear nothing. You cancelled your afternoon meetings yesterday. You walked the eastern ramparts twice in an hour. You haven't stood near a window since the moon started filling." I paused. "You're afraid of what it does to you when it comes and nothing answers." The page stopped turning. The silence was different from the ones before. Those had been calculating silences. Him measuring threat, measuring distance, deciding. This one was something he hadn't chosen. It had simply fallen over him, the way silence falls when something true has been said in a room that wasn't ready for it. He closed the census record. "You watched too closely," he said. His voice was even, controlled. But his hands, I had learned to read his hands, pressed flat against the cover a half-second longer than necessary. "Someone should," I said quietly. "Since you won't." He set the record back on the shelf with the careful precision of a man making sure his movements said nothing. "This conversation is finished," he said. He walked to the door. Stopped. Did not turn around. "The moon peaks in 4 days," he said to the doorframe, to the corridor beyond, to no one in particular. "Make sure your shutters are closed. The pack gets loud." He left. I looked at the empty doorway for a long moment. It was the closest thing to honesty he had offered me yet. And he had aimed it at a wall rather than my face. I heard him before I saw him. That was the thing about Alpha Kane, he was built to be heard. His voice carried through stone the way most men's couldn't carry across a room, and he used it constantly, filling corridors and courtyards with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been asked to be quieter. He arrived on a Friday with 40 warriors and no invitation. A summit, he called it. A courtesy visit between neighboring territories. The kind of language that means something else entirely when spoken by a man who rides through your gates without sending word ahead. The guards let him through because you do not close gates on an alpha with 40 warriors at his back, and because the alternative required a decision that hadn't been sanctioned yet. I watched the procession from the upper corridor window. Kane rode at the front on a gray horse, broad-shouldered and unhurried, wearing no formal colors. A deliberate choice, I noted. Formal colors meant protocol. Showing up in riding clothes meant he considered this a casual call. Meant he considered this fortress comfortable enough to arrive at uninvited. Meant he was making a point before he'd spoken a single word. I had been in this fortress long enough to understand the grammar of dominance displays. This one was fluent. He dismounted in the courtyard below and laughed at something one of his men said. A full, easy laugh, the kind produced by someone with nothing to prove. Then he looked up. Not at the fortress. Not at the gates. At the upper window where the Alpha King had appeared without my noticing. The two men looked at each other across the open courtyard. Kane smiled. The Alpha King did not. "Brother," Kane called up, using the honorary title pack leaders sometimes extended as false warmth. "You look well. Do you sleep? You look like a man who doesn't sleep. A beat. You look like a man who rode 4 hours without announcement," the Alpha King replied. "Come inside. We'll find you a room near the eastern wing. The beds are adequate." The eastern wing. Servants' quarters. Far from anything sensitive. Kane's smile didn't waver. He dipped his head in a shallow bow, just shallow enough to register, and followed the steward inside. I stepped back from the window. In 30 seconds of courtyard exchange I had learned several things. That Kane had come looking for weakness and had found a surface smooth enough to give him nothing. That the Alpha King had answered every move without raising his voice or his hands. And that Kane, for all his easy confidence, had looked up at that window with the eyes of a man who was counting something. Waiting for numbers that didn't add up to tell him something useful. I returned to my desk and pulled out a fresh ledger. I wrote nothing in it. I was thinking about the moon. It peaked in 2 days. And now there was a rival alpha in the fortress who would be watching. Kane made his move on Saturday morning over breakfast. Not privately. That was the point. He waited until the great hall was full. Generals, senior warriors, the beta, attendants, visiting riders, and then raised the matter of the full moon ritual the way you raise a knife at a table. Casually. With a smile. Imprecisely. "I had forgotten," he said loud enough to carry, "that the moon peaks tomorrow. What fortune. I haven't witnessed a formal pack shift in months." He looked down the table toward the head of it. "You'll be leading the ritual, of course." Every head in the hall performed the same small motion. The almost turn. The careful non-look toward the Alpha King that was itself a kind of looking. I was not in the Great Hall. I was in the corridor outside it, delivering a set of sealed records to the steward's station, and I heard it through the open archway as clearly as if I'd had a seat at the table. I stopped walking. "The ritual observance has been restructured this cycle," the beta said smoothly from somewhere near the head of the table. "Covering. Buying seconds. Timing considerations. I would think," Kane said pleasantly, "that the Alpha King can speak for his own rituals. Pause. Then his voice. Even. Unbothered. The same voice that had assigned Cain to the eastern wing without blinking. The ritual stands, the Alpha King said. Tomorrow night. Full observance. He had no choice. I understood that immediately, the way you understand a door closing in a room you're still standing in. Refusing would confirm whatever Cain had come looking for. Agreeing bought one day and cost everything the day after. He had agreed. I moved away from the archway before anyone came through it and walked back to the records hall with the sealed correspondence still under my arm, delivered to no one. I sat at my desk. The ritual stood. Full observance meant every ranking wolf shifted publicly before the pack. It was sacred, ceremonial, non-negotiable by any convention that mattered. The last time an alpha had declined to shift at a full moon summit, it had triggered a formal challenge within the hour. Cain knew that. He had known it when he arrived without announcement, without colors, with 40 warriors and a smile. He had not come for a courtesy visit. He had come for the ritual. I opened the ledger in front of me and turned to a fresh page and wrote, in the careful neutral script the records hall required, full moon ritual confirmed. All senior ranking wolves to attend. Moonrise. Then I sat very still and thought about the way the Alpha King's voice had not changed when he said it. Not a tremor. Not a fraction of hesitation. He had agreed to stand in front of his entire pack tomorrow night and attempt something he had not been able to do in 11 months. Because the alternative was worse. I closed the ledger. Then I went to find him. He was in the upper corridor when I found him. Alone, which meant he had shed his attendance deliberately, a thing I had learned he did when he needed to think without being watched. He was watching me now though as I came down the corridor toward him, and he did not look surprised. You were at the archway, he said. I was delivering records. You heard. Yes. He turned back to the narrow window at the corridor's end. Below, the courtyard was ordinary. Stable hands, a supply cart, 2 guards changing rotation. The mundane machinery of a fortress that did not know its foundation was cracking. I came to stand beside him. Not close. But closer than I had positioned myself before. You don't have to do it, I said. I do. There are precedents for postponement. Illness. Injury. I've been through the historical records. Twice in the last century an alpha has deferred a moon ritual without formal challenge being. Sarah. I stopped. He said my name the way you say a word when you want it to mean enough. Not unkind. Just finished. We stood at the window. The supply cart moved across the courtyard below. One of the stable hands laughed at something. I used to feel it, he said quietly. Before. The moon rising, it was like a tide inside the chest. Everything sharpening. The wolf rising up to meet it. He paused. It wasn't always comfortable. But it was there. It was mine. I said nothing. This was not a moment for responses. The night my father died, he stopped. Started again differently. The night I took the throne. Something severed. I felt it go the way you feel a bone break. That specific, irreversible knowledge that something has changed shape permanently inside you. His jaw tightened. By the next moon it was gone. The wolf did not answer. It has not answered since. The courtyard below went about its business. How long have you been attempting the shift? I asked carefully. Every full moon. Alone. Always alone. I looked at his profile. The exhaustion that lived there permanently, beneath the control, beneath the architecture of authority he wore like a second skin. I had catalogued it over weeks of watching. The sleeplessness, the careful avoidance, the hands that sometimes pressed flat against surfaces as if steadying something internal. I had thought I understood it. I hadn't. Not until now. It left me, he said. Simply. Finally. The way you say something you have never said aloud and find, in the saying of it, that the word is smaller than the weight you've been carrying. He did not look at me when he said it. I did not look away. Then we have one night, I said, to think of another way through tomorrow. He turned from the window. For the first time since I had opened the wrong door, he looked at me not as a variable, not as a threat, not as a loose thread requiring management. He looked at me like I might be something else entirely. The pack gathered at moonrise. I had never seen a full moon ritual before. Not properly, not from inside the fortress walls with a place among the witnesses. In the eastern servants' quarters we had watched from rooftops and upper windows, distant enough that it felt ceremonial in the abstract way that things feel ceremonial when they don't involve you. This was different. The lower yard had been transformed. Fire pits blazed in a wide ring, throwing amber light across packed earth that had been cleared of everything ordinary. The pack arranged themselves in a loose circle, warriors at the front, senior wolves behind, the rest pressing close in the outer dark. There were perhaps 200 bodies in that yard, and every one of them was oriented toward the center the way a compass orients north. Cain stood to the left of the fire line with his 40 riders. He had dressed properly tonight. Colors, formal leathers, the chain of his rank at his collar. He understood ceremony well enough to use it when it suited him. His expression was pleasant and patient and completely unreadable. I stood at the edge of the inner circle, close enough to the senior attendants that my presence registered as sanctioned. I had no business being here. I was here anyway. The beta opened the ritual. Old words, older than the fortress, older than the current pack structure. A recitation of territory and bloodline and moon-given right that the pack received with the focused stillness of people hearing something they know by heart but have not tired of. It moved through the crowd like a current. Then the shifting began. The senior wolves went first. One by one, stepping to the center, the transformation rolling through them with varying degrees of grace. Some smooth and practiced, some effortful, all of them completing. Each wolf that emerged shook itself once, oriented to the Alpha King's position, and stepped back. Acknowledgement. Hierarchy confirmed. Cain went near the end of the senior rankings. He shifted the way I imagined he did everything, with ease that was specifically engineered to be witnessed. Fluid, controlled, the wolf that emerged from him enormous and pale-furred and immediately visibly dominant. He held the shift for a long moment before the fire before stepping back, and in that moment he looked directly across the yard. Not at the crowd. At the Alpha King. Then it was his turn. The yard went quiet in the specific way of a held breath. 200 people and the silence was absolute. Only fire, only the distant sound of wind at the fortress walls. He stepped forward into the center of the ring and the firelight found him, and he was, even now, even knowing what I knew, the most commanding presence in that yard. He stood still. Seconds passed. I watched his shoulders. The almost imperceptible tension that moved through them. The stillness that was not calm but effort. The wolf being called and not answering, and the man holding the surface of himself together through will alone. More seconds. A murmur began at the edges of the crowd. Cain took one step forward. And I was already moving. I had not planned the words. That was the truth of it. Not bravery, not strategy, not some carefully constructed intervention I had rehearsed in the records hall between ledgers. I had simply watched Cain take that step forward and understood, with the clarity that sometimes arrives only when there is no time left for doubt, that if I did not move in the next 3 seconds something irreversible would happen. So I moved. The pack saw me before they understood what they were seeing. A woman crossing the fire ring. Not a wolf, not a warrior, no rank visible on her person, stepping into the center of a moon ritual with the kind of deliberate calm that either belongs to someone with authority or someone with nothing left to lose. I had neither. I stopped in the center of the ring beside him, and I did not look at Cain, and I did not look at the crowd, and I did not allow myself to look at the Alpha King's face, because if I saw his expression I would lose my nerve entirely. I looked at the ground. And I knelt. The silence that followed was a different animal from the one before. That silence had been anticipatory, a crowd waiting for something expected. This one was shock, pure and collective, 200 people recalibrating simultaneously. I kept my head down and spoke clearly enough to carry. I stand with him. 4 words. Ancient construction. The formal declaration of a fated bond. A claim made publicly before the pack, before the moon, before rival witnesses. I had found it in the historical records 3 days ago, tucked inside a territorial law compendium from 2 centuries back, and I had read it 4 times and closed the book and told myself it was simply interesting scholarship. I had not been honest with myself. The reaction moved through the crowd in waves. Confusion first, then recognition, then the particular charged energy of a pack encountering something that activates old instinct. The fated mate declaration was older than most of the laws currently governing them, older than the fortress itself, and it landed in their blood before their minds caught up. Kane stopped moving. I heard it rather than saw it, the shift in his footing, the pause. The beta's voice came from somewhere to my left, steady and practiced. By ancient right, the declared bond supersedes open challenge. The ritual observance is fulfilled through the mate claim. All challenges are deferred to the bonding period. A long silence. Then Kane's voice, still pleasant, still smiling, I could hear the smile in it. How fortunate. Congratulations are in order. He stepped back. I became aware slowly that the Alpha King had not moved since I knelt. Had not spoken. Had not, as far as I could tell, breathed. I finally looked up. He was staring at me with an expression I had not seen on him before and could not entirely name. It lived somewhere between fury and something that had no clean word. Something cracked open and raw and completely unguarded. It lasted 1 second. Then the mask came back. He reached down and helped me to my feet. He did not speak to me until the pack had dispersed. Not during the walk back through the fire ring. Not through the corridor. Not up the stairs to the inner wing where the torches burned steadier and the sound of the pack below faded to something distant and manageable. He walked and I followed, and the silence between us was not the calculating kind or the shocked kind. It was the kind that needed a room. He found one. A small council chamber off the main corridor, rarely used, the table inside dusty at the edges. He held the door and I went through and he closed it behind us, and that was the end of the quiet. What did you do? Not a question. The words arrived flat and precise, like stones placed deliberately. You know what I did. Say it. I invoked the ancient mate claim. I deferred Kane's challenge and fulfilled the ritual observance requirement simultaneously. Kept my voice even. It worked. It worked. He repeated it the way you repeat something that has arrived in the wrong language. You declared a bond that doesn't exist in front of 200 wolves and a rival alpha who will spend every waking hour between now and the next moon looking for proof that you lied. I know. You risked your life. No, I said. I risked yours. That landed. I watched it land, the slight shift in his jaw, the stillness that moved through him differently from his usual controlled stillness. This was the stillness of something recalibrating. The pack will expect a marking, he said. I know. They will expect a shift. A sign. Something that confirms the bond is real. I know that too. And you did it anyway. You were running out of seconds, I said. Kane was moving. Another 3 steps and the challenge would have been open, and then there were no good options. Only bad ones and worse ones. I chose the one that kept you on the throne tonight. He turned away from me. Moved to the narrow window at the chamber's end, his habitual position I had noticed, when he needed somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't a person. You don't know what you've bound yourself to, he said quietly. I've bound myself to nothing permanent. The ancient law allows a bonding period, time to establish proof of the claim. That's what the beta cited. We have until the next full moon. And then we find another way through. The same way we were going to find another way through last night before Kane forced the ritual forward. I paused. One problem at a time. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the last of the pack was moving back inside, the fire pits being banked by the yard attendants, the enormous charged energy of the ritual settling slowly back into ordinary night. Why, he said finally to the window, would you tie yourself to a wolfless king? It wasn't the question I had expected. I answered it honestly. Because you lead without instinct, I said. Without the wolf, without the tide in your chest, without any of the things your pack takes for granted. And the fortress still stands. The territory holds. Your generals follow. I let that sit for a moment. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you the most deliberate ruler in 5 territories. He did not turn around. But his hands, pressed flat against the windowsill, slowly released. I stopped sleeping properly after the ritual. Not from fear, or not only from fear. Mostly because the records hall had become a different place to me now, less a workspace and more a question I was trying to answer before time ran out. The moon would be full again in 26 days. Cain was still in the fortress, occupying his eastern wing room with the patient ease of a man who had nowhere better to be. And the pack, who had received the mate declaration with the complicated mixture of surprise and instinctive acceptance that old law tends to produce, was watching. Everything had a deadline now. I pulled the oldest texts from the restricted shelves on a Tuesday, 3 days after the ritual, using the archival access that had always been technically mine and had never before felt like a weapon. Territorial histories, bloodline records, moon cycle documentation going back 4 centuries. And then, near the bottom of a crate that smelled of a different century entirely, I found it. A compendium. Handwritten, the script cramped and deliberate, the ink gone to brown at the edges. No formal title on the cover, just 3 words pressed into the leather. Of Silent Wolves. I read it in one sitting through the afternoon and into the evening, with the hearth burning down around me and the corridor outside going quiet as the fortress moved towards sleep. It was not a myth. That was the first thing that struck me. The tone was clinical, observational, the record of a scholar who had encountered something real and was attempting to document it accurately. There had been others. Not many. But documented, named, their circumstances recorded with the careful neutrality of someone who understood what they were witnessing mattered. Wolves who had lost the bond. Not through physical injury. Not through illness or curse, though those explanations had been applied by the packs around them, because packs needed explanations that fit existing frameworks. The truth, as the scholar had recorded it, was quieter and more specific. The wolf does not die, the text read in the cramped brown script. It retreats. There is a distinction of great significance between these 2 states. A dead wolf cannot return. A retreated wolf is waiting. The retreat occurs in response to a fracture of identity so complete that the wolf, which is not separate from the man but is rather the most instinctual layer of him, withdraws to protect what remains. I read that passage 3 times. The wolves documented herein did not lose their bond through weakness. They lost it through a moment in which they became, in their own understanding, something they could not integrate. A king who executed his brother to prevent war. A warrior who survived a massacre that claimed his entire pack. A father who made an impossible choice. I set the book down. Picked it up again. In each case the retreat was not permanent. In each case the return of the bond was preceded not by dominance or force or repeated attempts at shifting, all of which, this scholar observed, appear to deepen the retreat rather than reverse it. The return was preceded by acceptance. Specifically, the moment the wolf recognized that the man had not become a monster. That the act, however terrible, had not destroyed what was worth preserving. The hearth had gone to embers. I sat in the cooling room with the compendium in my hands and thought about a king who had overthrown a tyrant father and lost his wolf the same night. Who had spent 11 months in an iron room trying to force back something that was not gone. Only hiding. Waiting for him to stop believing the worst of himself long enough to let it return. I closed the book carefully. I needed to talk to him. I found him in the iron room. Not during a full moon. There was no crisis, no ritual, no deadline driving him there tonight. He had simply gone the way I was beginning to understand he sometimes did, the way you return to the site of something unfinished because leaving it alone feels worse than facing it. The door was not locked. I pushed it open and he looked up from where he stood at the center of the room and did not tell me to leave. That itself felt significant. I came inside and set the compendium on the stone floor between us because it was heavy and because placing it down felt like the right grammar for what I was about to say. Here, this is what I found, this is why I'm here, this is not an ambush. He looked at it. Then at me. What is that? Documentation, I said. Of 11 other wolves who lost their bond. Recorded by a scholar 4 centuries ago who was precise enough to note not just what happened but why. I paused. And what reversed it? Something moved across his face. Carefully controlled, but I had been reading him for weeks now and I caught it. The flinch beneath the stillness. The instinct to dismiss warring with something that wanted badly to ask. He asked. What reversed it? Acceptance, I said. Not force. Every attempt to shift by will alone. The iron room, the chains, the repeated attempts. The scholar documented the same pattern across all 11 cases. Force deepens the retreat. The wolf isn't responding to dominance because it isn't withholding out of weakness. I held his gaze. It's protecting you. From what? From yourself. I took a breath. The wolf retreats when the man becomes, in his own understanding, something he cannot integrate. Something he believes makes him monstrous. I let that sit for exactly 1 second. You didn't lose your wolf the night you took the throne. You buried it. Under everything you decided that act made you. The room was very quiet. He did not move. Did not speak. But his breathing changed. Barely, just a fraction, the rhythm of it shifting the way breathing shifts when something has struck somewhere undefended. You don't know what I did, he said. I know you overthrew your father. I know what the records say. Then you know what he was. That's not... He stopped. Started again lower. Knowing what he was doesn't change what I did to end it. Knowing a thing is necessary doesn't make you clean afterward. No, I said. It doesn't. He looked at me. Surprised, I think, that I hadn't argued. But there's a distance, I continued carefully, between not being clean and being a monster. You've collapsed that distance into nothing. You've decided that because the act was terrible, the man who committed it must be irredeemable. I took 1 step closer. And the wolf, which is the most instinctual part of you, the part that knows you better than your own reflection, retreated because it couldn't reach you through that belief. His jaw tightened. You're telling me, he said slowly, that the wolf left because I decided I deserved to lose it. I'm telling you the wolf is still there, I said. Waiting for you to stop agreeing with the worst verdict you've ever handed down. I paused. The one you handed down on yourself. The torch on the wall guttered. He sat down. Not collapsed. Lowered himself to the stone floor with the deliberate care of a man whose legs have decided before his mind has. And sat with his forearms on his knees and his head dropped forward and breathed. Just breathed. I sat down across from him. On the floor. In the iron room with the chains on the walls and the old blood in the stone and the narrow window letting in a thin slip of ordinary night sky. We sat there for a long time. He did not speak again. But somewhere in the quality of the silence something had changed. Not the wolf, not yet. That would not be tonight. But the man had shifted just slightly, in the direction of something I did not have a name for yet. It felt like the beginning of mercy. Directed for the first time at himself. Cain announced his intention on a Monday morning 14 days before the next full moon in the Great Hall, over breakfast again. He had a pattern I had noticed. Important things at breakfast. In public. With an audience assembled through the ordinary machinery of mourning so that no one could claim they hadn't heard. The bonding period has been generous, he said pleasantly to the table, to no one specifically, which meant to everyone. But ancient law is precise on this point. Proof of bond must be demonstrated before the next full moon or the deferral expires. He lifted his cup. I simply want to ensure we're all observing the same calendar. The table received this in silence. The beta received it with the expression of a man adding something to a very long list. I received it from the corridor outside, where I had been passing with a stack of territorial correspondence. And I stopped walking for the second time in a month outside that archway and understood that the clock I had been managing carefully in the back of my mind had just been moved forward by someone else's hand. 14 days. I found him in the upper corridor an hour later. He already knew. Word moved through a fortress the way water moves through stone, finding every crack. He was standing at the window that had become, over weeks, something like his thinking post, and he turned when he heard me coming and spoke before I reached him. He's not wrong, he said. About the calendar. No. The law requires a marking. Or a witness shift. Something the pack can point to. I know. We have 14 days. I know that too. He looked at me steadily. In the weeks since the iron room, since the floor, since the silence that had changed shape around us, something had shifted in the way he occupied space near me. The calculated distance he had maintained so carefully in the beginning had not disappeared, but it had loosened. He stood closer now without the air of a man managing a threat. It was a small thing. I had noticed it immediately. There's a third option, I said. Beyond the marking and the shift. He waited. You face him directly. At the full moon. Not forcing the shift, not the way you've been doing it. The compendium was specific about that. I chose my words carefully. You go to the ritual differently than you've gone to the Iron Room. Not as a man trying to prove something. Not alone. He was quiet for a moment. The scholar's documentation, he said. The 11 wolves. How long did it take after the acceptance before the bond returned? I had been waiting for this question. Had prepared for it honestly, which meant the answer was not entirely comfortable. It varied, I said. For some days. For one, a single night. I paused. For 2 of them it happened in the moment of greatest stakes. When something external clarified what the internal work had already done. Meaning it can't be scheduled. Meaning it can't be forced. There's a difference. He turned back to the window. Below, the courtyard was ordinary. A delivery being unloaded, 2 guards in quiet conversation, a dog crossing the far corner with tremendous purpose. The mundane world moving forward regardless. Cain will be watching for failure, he said. Cain has been watching for failure since he arrived. That hasn't changed. I moved to stand beside him at the window. What's changed is that you're not the same man who was on his knees in that room the night I opened the wrong door. He looked at me sidelong. You don't know that, he said. But it was quiet. Not a dismissal, almost a question. You sat on the floor of the Iron Room, I said. You stopped fighting long enough to breathe. That man could not have done that 6 weeks ago. I held his gaze. I was there. I watched. A long pause. You watched too closely, he said. It was what he had said to me in the records hall weeks ago, the first time I had named his fear aloud. But the tone had changed entirely. It had lost its edge. In its place was something I was careful not to examine too directly. Someone should, I said. Same answer as before. This time he didn't walk away. He stood at the window beside me while the courtyard went about its business below, and the 14 days arranged themselves ahead of us like a corridor with a door at the end, and neither of us spoke about what might or might not be waiting on the other side of it. But we stood there together. And that for now was different enough. The pack gathered at moonrise for the second time in a month. The energy was different from the first ritual. Tighter. More deliberate. The fire pits burned in the same ring, but the crowd arranged itself with the particular charged stillness of people who understood that what they were witnessing tonight was not ceremonial. It was consequential. Cain stood in his position to the left of the fire line. Same place as before. Same pleasant expression. He had dressed formally again. Colors, rank, chain, everything correct. And he held a cup of something and looked entirely comfortable, which was the most dangerous thing about him. I stood at the edge of the inner circle. My heart was doing something irregular that I was choosing not to monitor too closely. The beta opened the ritual. The old words moved through the crowd the same way they always did, landing in the blood before the mind. And the pack received them with the focused stillness of people who had been doing this since before memory. Then the shifting began. Senior wolves first. One by one. Each completing. Cain shifted when his turn came. The same enormous pale wolf, the same engineered ease. The same moment held before the fire for precisely long enough to be witnessed. He stepped back and looked across the yard, and this time he was not looking at the Alpha King. He was looking at me. I held his gaze until he looked away. Then it was his turn. He stepped into the center of the ring and the firelight found him and the yard went quiet. The same absolute quiet as before, 200 people and only fire and wind. I watched him. He was standing differently. That was the first thing I noticed. And I had catalogued enough of his posture over enough weeks to read the difference clearly. Before, at the first ritual, the tension had been in his shoulders, in his hands, in the effort of a man bracing against something. Holding himself together through will. Tonight he was still. Not the effortful stillness of control. Something quieter than that. He was not bracing. He was not forcing. He stood in the center of the fire ring with his eyes forward and his hands loose at his sides, and he looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a man who had put something down. A long moment passed. Then he looked at me. Not at the moon. Not at Kane. Not at the pack arranged in their expectant circle. At me. And I looked back. I did not nod or gesture or do anything that could be read by the crowd around us. I simply held his gaze the way I had held it in the iron room on the first night, in the corridor, on the floor, at every window. Steadily, without flinching, the way you look at someone when you want them to know that whatever happens next you are not going anywhere. Something moved across his face. Not the mask. Beneath it. Then his breath released. Slowly, completely, the breath of a man setting down 11 months of weight. And I heard it. Not a crack. Not the violent wrongness of a shift forced against resistance. Something else entirely. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the center of him rather than his bones, low and steady and certain, and the air around him changed quality the way air changes before weather arrives. The pack felt it before they saw it. I watched 200 wolves go perfectly, collectively still. The shift moved through him like water finding its level. Unhurried. Complete. Bone and muscle and sinew rearranging, not in agony but in something that looked. And I understood only afterward that this was the right word. Like relief. Like a river returning to a channel it had always belonged in. The wolf that emerged was enormous. Darker than I had imagined. Black at the shoulders, fading to deep gray at the edges. With the same gold eyes that had pinned me against a door in a corridor that felt like a different life. He was still for a moment in the center of the fire ring, four-footed and real and completely present. And the silence around him was the silence of 200 wolves encountering something that rearranged their understanding of the last 11 months all at once. Then Kane's cup hit the ground. It was such a small sound against the silence. But it was the sound of a calculation failing. Of a man who had arrived at this fortress with 40 warriors and a smile and a calendar, and had just watched every piece of his strategy become irrelevant in the space of a single breath. The pack dropped to their knees. Not commanded. Not requested. The spontaneous, instinctive genuflection of wolves in the presence of something that confirmed, at the level of blood and bone, that their alpha was exactly what they had always needed him to be. The wolf in the center of the ring turned his gold eyes to me. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was already on my knees. Not from instinct. Not from pack impulse. From something else entirely. Something I was done pretending I didn't feel. He shifted back before the fire had burned low. The pack remained kneeling until he was upright again, until he had dressed in the cloak someone had the presence of mind to bring forward, until he was standing in the center of the ring fully himself. Both versions of himself integrated in a way that had not been true for 11 months. And only then did he raise one hand and let them rise. They rose. And the yard exhaled. I was on my feet too at the edge of the circle, and I watched him move through the shift back with the same quiet steadiness he had brought to the shift forward. No performance. No display engineered for the crowd. He simply returned to himself and stood there and let the pack absorb it. Kane had not moved from his position. His cup was still on the ground where it had fallen. He had not picked it up. Around him his 40 riders had done what the rest of the pack had done. Knelt, risen, and now stood in a cluster slightly behind him, recalibrated, reading their alpha's stillness for instruction. The fortress alpha walked toward him. The crowd parted without being asked. It did not part the way crowds part for authority. The commanded, managed movement of people making way. It parted the way water parts for something that has always belonged at the center of it. Instinctive. Immediate. He stopped 2 feet from Kane. The two men looked at each other, and I was close enough now, having moved through the parting crowd without entirely deciding to, that I could see both their faces clearly. Kane's expression had reorganized itself into something that was almost, not quite, respect. The smile was gone. In its place was the careful neutrality of a man reassessing from the ground up. A remarkable evening, Kane said. It is, the Alpha King agreed. Pause. The challenge deferral expires tonight, Kane said. Not a threat. A statement of fact, offered with the precision of someone who understood that threatening was no longer his strongest position. By ancient law the open challenge can be reinstated. Combat or forfeit. I know the law. Then you know I have standing. You have standing, he agreed. You also have 40 riders who have been housed and fed at my expense for 3 weeks. a territory that has been unattended in your absence, and a pack of your own that is watching how this evening resolves. He let that land for a moment. Challenge me tonight and we fight. You may win, I won't pretend certainty either way. But your pack watches their alpha choose combat over diplomacy after witnessing what they just witnessed. That story follows you home. King was quiet. Or, the Alpha King continued, you accept the hospitality of a formal dinner tomorrow. We negotiate the boundary dispute that actually brought you here, because we both know the ritual was a pretense for the land question along the northern ridge. We reach an agreement that benefits both territories. And you ride home having resolved something real. A long silence. The fire crackled. 200 wolves waited. Cain looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating every assumption he had arrived with. Then he looked at me briefly as if I were a variable he was still trying to place correctly in the equation. Then back. Dinner, he said finally. Tomorrow. He bent and picked up his cup from the ground. Turned and walked back toward the fortress without further ceremony, his riders falling in behind him, the particular energy of a man who has decided that recalibrating is not the same as retreating. The Alpha King watched him go. Then he turned and found me in the crowd with the directness he had always had, that quality of locating exactly what he was looking for without searching. He crossed to where I stood. Around us the pack was beginning to move, the ritual energy releasing into conversation and movement, the yard filling with sound for the first time in an hour. We were not alone, not exactly, but we were contained within the particular privacy of a crowd paying attention to itself. The boundary dispute, I said quietly, along the northern ridge, has been in the records hall for 2 years, he said. Unresolved. I know. I filed the correspondence. I paused. I can have the relevant documentation on the council table by morning. Something moved in his expression. That almost smile I had catalogued twice before, rare, barely there, gone before it fully arrived. I know you can, he said. We stood in the cooling yard with the fire burning down around us and the pack moving through the ordinary aftermath of something extraordinary, and I thought about 11 months of iron rooms and forced attempts in silence swallowed behind thick doors, and the compendium on the floor between us, and a man sitting down on cold stone because his legs had decided before his mind had. And I thought about gold eyes finding mine across a fire ring. You didn't kill him, I said. He understood immediately who I meant. No, he said quietly. The scholar documented that too, I said. The wolves who found their way back. None of them were the same afterward. But none of them became what they feared they had become either. I held his gaze. There's a difference between a man who is capable of terrible things and a man who is defined by them. He looked at me for a long moment. You've been making that argument for weeks, he said. You've been almost believing it for almost as long. The almost smile again. Closer this time. Almost, he agreed. The last of the fire pits was being banked. The yard was nearly empty now, the pack filtering back inside, the night settling into the particular quiet that follows something that will be discussed for years. He offered me his arm. Not a declaration. Not a performance for any remaining witnesses. Simply an arm extended in the direction of the fortress door. I took it. We walked inside. I was at the window when the sky began to change. Not the records hall window, not the corridor window, not any of the windows I had stood at over weeks of watching and cataloging and learning the shape of a man through careful observation. This was the window of the upper chamber. His study technically, though I had spent enough hours in it recently that the distinction had grown imprecise. And it faced east, and the horizon was doing something slow and extraordinary with light. I had not slept. Not from worry. That was the difference, and I noticed it specifically because the quality of sleeplessness I had accumulated over the past weeks had always carried that particular weight. The turning over, the deadline counting, the mental ledger of problems requiring solutions before morning. Last night had been different. Last night I had simply been awake, in the way you are awake when something has resolved and the mind doesn't yet know what to do with the unfamiliar absence of urgency. The fortress was quiet around me. Cain and his riders would depart after the boundary negotiation. The documentation was already on the council table, neat and complete, pulled from 2 years of unresolved correspondence and organized into something workable. That problem had a shape now. Most of the problems had shapes now. I heard him before I saw him. His footsteps were distinctive, unhurried, deliberate, the specific rhythm of a man who had never needed to announce himself because rooms rearranged around his arrival regardless. He came to stand beside me at the window. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the horizon do its slow work. The sky was moving through gray into something warmer, the first suggestion of color appearing at the eastern edge where the land flattened beyond the fortress walls. "The council documentation," he said, "is ready." "I know. I looked at it an hour ago." "Boss. It's thorough. 2 years of correspondence. It wasn't difficult to organize. Someone should have done it earlier." "Someone did," he said. "Last night. At what I suspect was an unreasonable hour." I said nothing. The horizon continued its patient work. "The pack will expect clarity," he said after a moment. "About the bond declaration. About what it means going forward." "I know. That's a conversation that requires decisions. From both of us." "I know that too." He turned from the window to look at me directly and I turned to meet it, and we looked at each other in the early gray light of a morning that felt genuinely new in the specific way mornings only occasionally do. Not metaphorically new, not the false reset of an ordinary dawn, but the kind of morning that arrives after something has actually changed and the light seems to understand that. "You opened the wrong door," he said. "Yes." "You heard bone cracking and followed it instead of walking away." "Yes." "You knelt in front of 200 wolves for a king you had known for 6 weeks. 7, I said. By that point, something shifted in his face. The mask, which I had watched loosen by degrees over 7 weeks, which had slipped entirely on a stone floor in an iron room and had not returned quite as completely afterward, was not present this morning. What was underneath it was quieter and more unguarded than anything the mask had ever produced. He looked, I thought, like himself. Whatever that meant for a man who had spent 11 months at war with his own nature. It looked like this. Like standing at a window in early light without bracing against anything. "I owe you a debt," he said, "that I am not certain how to repay." "You don't owe me anything, Sarah." "I opened the door because I wanted to," I said. "Everything after was the same. I didn't do it for debt or obligation or because I had no choice." I held his gaze. "I did it because you were worth doing it for. That's not something you repay. That's just true." The silence that followed was the best kind. Not loaded, not calculated, not the silence of two people managing each other carefully. Just two people standing in it without needing it to be anything else. Then he reached out. Not for my throat. Not to pin me against a door with a message about survival. He raised his hand slowly and with complete intention and tucked a piece of hair back from my face with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is not going to pretend otherwise. His hand stilled at my jaw. I did not move. "I would like," he said quietly, "to mark you. Not a command. Not a political statement." The words arrived stripped of every layer of strategy and authority and calculation, with nothing underneath them but what they actually were. A man asking. "Yes," I said. Outside the window, the sun cleared the horizon. The light arrived all at once, gold and clean and indifferent to everything that had brought us to this window, this morning, this answer, and it fell across the stone floor of the upper chamber and across the desk with its organized correspondence and across the two of us standing at the edge of something that had no name yet but did not need one. Below, the fortress woke. The training yard began its morning rhythm. The stable hands called to each other across the courtyard. Somewhere a door opened and the smell of the kitchens reached even this high, bread and wood smoke and the ordinary beginning of an ordinary day in a place that had quietly, irrevocably changed. He marked me as the sun rose. And when it was done he stayed at the window beside me, and we watched the light move across the territory that was his. The land and the tree line and the distant ridge where the boundary dispute had been and would soon not be. And neither of us spoke for a long time. There was nothing left that needed saying. The wolf had come home. And so, without having planned it, without having seen it coming on the night, I followed the sound of breaking bone down a forbidden corridor, had I. And just like that, The wolf returned. Not because he forced it. Not because he proved dominance. But because someone saw him without it. Now I want to ask you something. When his wolf left him, was he still an alpha? Or did she make him one again? Tell me what you think in the comments. And be honest. If you had discovered that secret behind the iron door, would you have protected him the way she did? Or would you have used it? If you're still here, still listening under this moon with me, make sure you like the video and subscribe to join the pack. Because next time, the secret won't stay buried. Fire.